The porch creaked beneath Emmett's worn boots as he stared at the empty rocking chair, its chain still swaying from the morning wind that carried no warmth, no voice, no promise of her return. The cabin held its breath. 3 months had passed since Martha's footprints disappeared into the frost-covered morning, and Emmett Dawson still found himself setting 2 coffee cups on the kitchen table out of habit. The second cup would sit there, growing cold, while he stared at the steam rising from his own, a daily ritual of remembering what he'd lost without ever understanding why. The silence pressed against the log walls like a living thing. Even the crackling of the wood stove seemed muted, as if the fire itself mourned Martha's absence. Emmett's calloused hands, scarred from decades of timber work, trembled slightly as he reached for the morning paper. The words blurred together, meaningless marks on newsprint that couldn't fill the void where her voice used to read him the weather forecast and local news. Outside, the Georgia pines swayed in the October wind, their needles whispering secrets he couldn't decipher. The sound reminded him of Martha's soft humming as she tended her herb garden, a melody that had become so much a part of his daily rhythm that its absence felt like losing his heartbeat. He'd catch himself listening for it, turning his head toward the kitchen window where she used to stand, washing dishes and watching the birds at the feeder she'd hung from the old oak's lowest branch. Duke, his bloodhound, lay sprawled across the cabin's threshold, his grizzled muzzle resting on enormous paws. The dog's deep brown eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence, followed Emmett's every movement. At 12 years old, Duke moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his loyalty remained unwavering. The hound had been Martha's constant companion during her morning walks, and since her departure he'd taken to sitting by the door at dawn, waiting for a walk that would never come. The morning stretched endlessly ahead. Emmett pushed back from the table, the chair legs scraping against the pine floor with a sound that echoed too loudly in the empty space. He needed to split wood, the pile was running low, and winter would arrive soon with its bitter teeth. Physical labor had always been his answer to problems he couldn't solve with words, and God knew he'd never been good with words anyway. The axe felt familiar in his hands, its weight a comfort against the uncertainty that had settled into his bones. Each swing carried the force of his confusion, his anger, his desperate need to understand why she'd left without a word. The rhythm of splitting wood had always cleared his mind, but now it only amplified the questions that plagued his sleepless nights. Had he been too distant? Too absorbed in his work? Too blind to see whatever pain had driven her away? As he worked, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air, Emmett caught sight of Duke watching him from the porch. The dog's expression held something almost human, a sadness that seemed to echo his own grief. It was then that Emmett realized he wasn't the only one who'd been abandoned. Duke had lost Martha too, and perhaps the old hound understood something about loyalty and loss that Emmett was only beginning to grasp. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like Martha's ghost, and Emmett had learned to read the signs in Duke's behavior. When the bloodhound's ears perked forward and his tail began that slow, deliberate wag, it usually meant deer were passing through the lower meadow. But this morning, Duke's posture was different. Alert, yes, but with an urgency that made Emmett pause mid-swing. The dog's deep baying cut through the quiet like a blade through fabric. Not the excited howl of a hunt, but something mournful, almost pleading. Duke had wandered toward the edge of the property, where the cultivated yard gave way to wild forest, and his cries seemed to be calling for something, or someone, who couldn't answer. Emmett set down his axe and followed the sound, his boots crunching through the carpet of fallen leaves. The October air carried the scent of decay and renewal, the eternal cycle of the forest that had always comforted him. But today, even nature's rhythms felt wrong, as if the world itself was mourning alongside him. He found Duke at the base of the old oak tree where Martha used to collect wild herbs for her teas and remedies. The dog was digging frantically, his powerful claws tearing at the soft earth with a desperation that sent chills down Emmett's spine. Dirt flew in all directions as Duke worked, his breathing labored but determined, as if he was racing against time itself. "Duke, what's got into you, boy?" Emmett's voice came out rougher than intended, cracked from disuse and emotion. The dog glanced up briefly, his eyes wild with something that looked almost like hope, before returning to his excavation with renewed vigor. Something glinted in the disturbed earth, not the white of bone that Emmett had feared, but the clear surface of glass. Duke stepped back, panting heavily, and allowed Emmett to kneel beside the shallow hole. With trembling fingers, he brushed away the remaining dirt to reveal a mason jar, its metal lid rusted but still intact, sealed with what looked like candle wax. The jar felt heavier than it should have as Emmett lifted it from its earthen grave. Through the glass, he could see papers inside, protected from moisture and time by Martha's careful preservation. His heart hammered against his ribs as recognition dawned. He knew Martha's handwriting, had seen it on shopping lists and birthday cards for 37 years. But these weren't grocery reminders or love notes. These were pages torn from something more intimate, folded small and tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to gray. Duke whined softly and nudged against Emmett's leg, as if urging him to open the jar. The old hound's instincts had led them here, to this burial ground of secrets that Martha had never intended to share. Emmett's hands shook as he worked at the wax seal, his calloused fingers suddenly clumsy with anticipation and dread. The lid finally gave way with a soft pop, and the scent of old paper and lavender escaped into the morning air. Martha had always smelled of lavender, had grown it in her garden and dried it in small bundles that she tucked into drawers and closets. The familiar fragrance hit Emmett like a blow to the chest, bringing with it a rush of memories so vivid he could almost see her standing there among the herbs, her graying hair caught in the morning sunlight. Inside the jar, the papers were wrapped in a piece of linen, one of Martha's good handkerchiefs, the kind she'd saved for special occasions. As Emmett carefully unfolded the fabric, his eyes filled with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 3 months. Duke pressed closer, his warm weight a solid comfort against Emmett's leg, as if the dog understood that whatever they'd found would change everything. The first page trembled in Emmett's weathered hands as he read Martha's familiar script, each letter carefully formed despite the obvious emotion behind the words. The date at the top made his chest tighten, just 2 weeks before she'd disappeared. The entry began simply, "I don't know how to tell him that I'm drowning." Emmett had to stop reading. The words blurred as tears he'd held back for months finally broke free. Duke moved closer, his massive head resting against Emmett's thigh, offering the only comfort he could give. The morning air felt colder suddenly, as if Martha's secrets had brought winter early to the Georgia mountains. "I wake up every morning and put on the same face," Martha had written, "the one that makes breakfast and asks about his day and pretends that everything is fine. But inside, I'm disappearing. I can feel myself becoming smaller and smaller until I'm afraid that one day I'll just stop existing altogether." Each page revealed another layer of pain that Martha had hidden behind her quiet smile and gentle manner. She wrote about the weight of sadness that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She described feeling like a ghost in her own life, going through the motions of living while feeling increasingly disconnected from everything and everyone around her. "Emmett works so hard," one passage read, "and he's carrying enough weight for both of us. How can I tell him that some days I can barely get out of bed? How can I add my broken pieces to his burden when he's already doing so much just to keep us afloat?" The words hit Emmett like physical blows. He'd been so focused on his own struggles, the failing sawmill, the mounting bills, the constant worry about their future, that he'd failed to see his wife's silent suffering. She'd been protecting him from her pain, just as he'd thought he was protecting her from his worries. Martha had written about the mornings when she'd force herself to smile and make coffee, when all she wanted was to crawl back into bed and pull the covers over her head. She'd described the crushing loneliness of being surrounded by love but feeling unable to accept it, unable to believe she deserved it. "I see the way he looks at me sometimes," she'd written, "like he's trying to figure out what's wrong, but he's too afraid to ask. And I'm too afraid to tell him. What if he realizes that I'm not the woman he married? What if he sees that I'm just broken?" Duke shifted beside him, and Emmett realized he'd been crying openly, tears dropping onto the pages and threatening to smudge Martha's careful words. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to steady himself enough to continue reading. The later entries revealed Martha's growing desperation, her feeling that she was becoming a burden to everyone around her. She'd written about withdrawing from friends, avoiding phone calls, and spending hours staring out the kitchen window at the herb garden that had once brought her such joy. "I planted the lavender for him," one entry read, "because he said he liked the smell. But now I can't even tend to it without feeling like I'm failing at the one thing I'm supposed to be good at." How do you tell someone you love that you're drowning when they're standing right next to you? The final entry was dated just 3 days before Martha's disappearance. Her handwriting was shakier, more hurried, as if she'd been writing in the dark. "I'm leaving this here because I don't want him to blame himself. I don't want him to think he could have saved me. Some people are just meant to be broken, and I can't keep pretending that love is enough to fix everything. Maybe if I go, he'll find someone whole to love." Emmett closed his eyes, the papers falling to his lap as the full weight of Martha's words settled over him. She hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She'd left because she loved him too much to let him watch her fall apart. And in trying to protect him from her pain, she'd condemned them both to a different kind of suffering. The mason jar sat empty on the kitchen table, its contents spread before Emmett like pieces of a broken heart waiting to be reassembled. For 2 days, he'd read and reread Martha's words, each passage revealing new layers of the woman he'd thought he knew completely. Duke hadn't left his side, as if the old hound understood that something fundamental had shifted in their small world. On the 3rd morning, Emmett woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in months. The fog of confusion and anger that had clouded his mind since Martha's departure had lifted, replaced by something harder to bear but infinitely more honest, understanding. He dressed carefully, choosing his best flannel shirt and the boots Martha had given him for his last birthday. Then he gathered her diary pages and walked outside. The herb garden was a tangle of weeds and neglect, but the lavender had survived. Its purple spikes pushed through the undergrowth like stubborn hope, releasing their familiar fragrance when Emmett brushed against them. He knelt in the dirt, Duke settling beside him, and began to clear away the debris that had accumulated over the months of neglect. His hands moved with purpose, pulling weeds and cutting back the overgrown plants. As he worked, he talked to Martha as if she were still there, his voice carrying across the empty morning air. "I'm sorry I didn't see," he said simply. "I'm sorry you felt like you had to carry all that pain alone." The work was meditation and penance combined. Each plant he rescued from the weeds felt like a small act of redemption, a way of honoring the woman who'd tended this garden with such care. He found remnants of her presence everywhere. Stakes she'd used to support the tomatoes, labels she'd written in her careful script, the small stone border she'd laid around the mint patch to keep it from spreading. By midday, the garden was transformed. Not perfect, not the way Martha would have kept it, but alive again. Emmett sat back on his heels, sweat beading on his forehead, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of accomplishment that wasn't tied to his own survival. Duke lifted his head, ears perked, and Emmett followed the dog's gaze to the dirt road that led to their property. A small figure was walking toward them, Sarah Thompson, Martha's closest friend, carrying what looked like a casserole dish. Emmett's first instinct was to retreat into the cabin, to avoid the conversation he knew was coming. But Martha's words echoed in his mind. "How do you tell someone you love that you're drowning when they're standing right next to you?" Sarah approached cautiously, her eyes taking in the restored garden and Emmett's dirt-stained clothes. "I brought tuna casserole," she said simply. "Martha always said it was your favorite." For a moment, Emmett couldn't speak. Then, to his own surprise, he found himself telling Sarah everything, about the jar, about Martha's hidden pain, about his own failure to see what was happening right in front of him. The words came haltingly at first, then in a rush that felt like a dam breaking. Sarah listened without judgment, her eyes filling with tears as Emmett read selected passages from Martha's diary. When he finished, She reached across the space between them and took his calloused hand in her smaller one. "She was sick, Emmett," Sarah said gently. "What she had wasn't something you could fix with love or attention. It was bigger than both of you." That evening, as the sun set behind the pines, Emmett sat on the porch with Duke at his feet and Martha's diary in his lap. He decided to add his own words to hers, not trying to answer her pain, but acknowledging it, honoring it, and finally saying the things he'd never found the courage to say while she was alive. "Dear Martha," he wrote in his careful script, "I found your words today, and they broke my heart in all the right ways. I'm sorry I didn't know how to help you carry your sadness. I'm sorry I was so busy trying to fix everything else that I missed the one thing that mattered most. But I want you to know that you were never broken to me. You were perfect in your imperfection, beautiful in your struggle, and I loved every part of you, even the parts you thought you had to hide." He paused, looking out at the garden where the lavender released its evening fragrance into the cooling air. "I'm going to plant more lavender," he continued, "and I'm going to tend this garden the way you taught me to tend everything, with patience, with care, and with the understanding that some things grow best in the dark before they reach for the light." Duke stirred at his feet, and Emmett reached down to scratch behind the old dog's ears. "And I'm going to talk to people," he wrote. "I'm going to tell them about you, about us, about what it means to love someone who's fighting battles you can't see. Maybe that's how we honor the broken places, by admitting they exist, by refusing to let them stay buried." As night fell over the mountains, Emmett folded his letter and placed it in the mason jar with Martha's diary. Tomorrow he would return it to the earth beneath the oak tree, but this time it wouldn't be a grave. It would be a garden, a place where love and loss could grow together, where truth could take root in the dark soil of understanding. The porch creaked beneath his rocking chair as he settled in for the night, Duke's steady breathing a comfort in the darkness. For the first time in 3 months, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility, of healing, of the quiet strength that sometimes grows from the deepest wounds. If Emmett's story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the silent battles fought in the quiet corners of our lives, or if it kindled hope in the midst of your own difficult journey, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that healing is possible even in the darkest seasons. And of course, subscribe to our channel. Here we tell stories that heal, inspire, and prove that love endures even when it feels lost. Until next time, never stop believing in the power of understanding, and never forget that sometimes the most profound healing happens when we finally learn to tend the broken places with the same care we give to everything else we love.